As Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial charges into its second week, prosecutors are painting a damning picture that the hip-hop mogul didn't just commit isolated crimes, but essentially ran a criminal enterprise through his business empire. From violent assaults to bribery, blackmail, drug-fueled freak-offs, witnesses have described a culture of fear and control operating behind the scenes. But the big question now is, has the government actually succeeded in proving that Combs was running a criminal enterprise? Have they succeeded in proving racketeering conspiracy the top charge in this case? Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be speaking with former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani to get to the bottom of this. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes a few minutes. You don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on screen, click the link below, or head over to forthepeople.com/LCDepo to see if you qualify. As Sean Diddy Combs' federal sex trafficking, racketeering, and prostitution trial enters its second week, prosecutors are methodically building their case that the hip-hop mogul didn't just commit crimes, but that he essentially operated an entire criminal enterprise through his bad boy records empire. The 55-year-old music titan, or once music titan, stands accused of sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, transporting individuals for prostitution, charges that he adamantly denies. But the most serious allegation, racketeering, the RICO Act, could mean decades behind bars if he's convicted, maybe even life in prison. That's what we're talking about here. And essentially, prosecutors claim that Combs used his business empire to facilitate a pattern of criminal activity, from allegedly organizing drug-fueled freak-off sex sessions to covering up violent assaults. They've presented testimony about threats, bribes, a culture of fear among Combs' inner circle, but with the defense arguing that there were personal failings rather than organized crimes, the crucial question remains, has the government actually proven RICO? Have they proven Diddy ran a criminal enterprise? Have they proved the racketeering charge, this top charge? Or simply just that he's a powerful man who did terrible things? That answer could determine whether the bad boy founder walks free or, again, spends the rest of his life in prison. That's the central question that we're tackling in this episode of Sidebar. But first, let me break down really quickly what racketeering actually means in this case, okay? So the indictment, and he's been facing a lot of indictments, number of superseding indictments, but basically the indictment against Sean Combs uses the RICO Act to define racketeering as, quote, knowingly combining, conspiring, confederating, and agreeing to conduct and participate directly and indirectly in the conduct of the affairs of the Combs enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. So for prosecutors to make the charge stick, there are three elements that they have to prove. First, they got to show the existence of a criminal enterprise. So in this case, what the indictment calls the Combs enterprise. And this allegedly includes not just Sean Combs himself, but his business entities like Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs Global, along with employees, associates, other unnamed participants. And according to the indictment, this was an ongoing criminal organization, quote, whose members functioned as a continuing unit for a common purpose of achieving the objectives of the Combs enterprise. Second, prosecutors have to demonstrate that this enterprise engaged in a pattern of illegal acts. The indictment alleges Combs, quote, created a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice. And finally, there has to be the existence of a conspiracy, because the charge is actually racketeering conspiracy. So we're talking about an agreement between Combs and another or others to participate in this criminal enterprise with the intent to commit at least two of the so-called predicate crimes, the underlying offenses that form the basis of the racketeering charge. Again, kidnapping, sex trafficking, arson, Their central argument is that Combs, quote, used the Combs business, including certain employees, to carry out, facilitate, and cover up his abuse and commercial sex. So they claim that he used coercion, violence, threats of retaliation to manipulate women into participating in highly orchestrated sexual encounters, all while silencing potential witnesses. And also, it makes up the sex trafficking claims, too. And they point to allegations that Combs directed employees to stock hotel rooms with supplies for the so-called freak-offs, lubricants, drugs, baby oil, that they had to clean everything up afterwards. They also claim that he obtained controlled substances to keep victims compliant. So now we return to the central question here, the critical question. With all of this in mind, at this point in time, week 2, has the prosecution presented enough evidence to prove Sean Combs conspired to commit racketeering? And look, I know they have a lot more of a case, but at this point, have they proved it yet? Well, to help me answer that question, I'm going to bring in former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani, who I love having on, his expert opinion. Who doesn't like to see Neama? I mean, honestly, who doesn't like to see Neama? So Neama, first of all, anything I missed about the definition of racketeering conspiracy? Did I hit it all, or anything you would add?
Jesse, love to be on, and you covered it. And, you know, as prosecutors, former prosecutors, we love racketeering. And obviously we've seen it in other sex trafficking cases recently with R. Kelly and the NXIVM case. But even in non-mob, street gang, cartel cases, we're seeing prosecutors use it more and more. We saw it in the Trump-Fulton County case, for instance, because it allows prosecutors to bring in a lot of evidence and a lot of people into the criminal case and lean on them and flip on them. And of course, obviously federal racketeering carries a potential life sentence as well. But, you know, going through the elements, like you said, first you need that criminal enterprise. And it doesn't have to be the mob. It doesn't have to be a rigid structure. It's a loose association of 2 or more people. That's enough, Jesse, for the criminal enterprise. You have that common scheme. And that's not really hard to prove, you know, especially when someone is working for their boss, Sean Diddy Combs. Then you have the pattern of racketeering activity. And I think that's what people really care about. And I think what's really important about RICO in this case is there is a path for the government to get a RICO conviction, a racketeering conviction, even if they lose on sex trafficking, because there are other predicate offenses. So even if the jurors think that the freak-offs were consensual and there was no force or coercion, it still might get racketeering. That's why I think it's a very important charge. I think prostitution has been established. And then, of course, the conspiracy, which is just an unlawful agreement. But going through the different RICO predicate acts, I think the video from 2016 from the Intercontinental Hotel shows kidnapping, right? That is enough, in my opinion. Kidnapping isn't necessarily throwing someone in the back of a white van and taking off. As long as you use force to move someone or even potentially prevent them from moving, that's kidnapping. Obviously, arson, we talked about.
Let's get into this. There's a lot that we have to get into because I want to go into the specifics, and you tell me if it meets the definition of racketeering or helps with the racketeering charge. So let me first start off with David James. This is Diddy's former personal assistant. This is somebody that I was anticipating would be called, not necessarily him per se, but if you're going to say assistants helped facilitate this criminal behavior, you're going to have to call the people in his inner circle. Because after all, Combs didn't allegedly just do this on his own. So James worked for Combs from 2007 to 2009. And right from his job interview, James says that he was given a very telling introduction to how things worked. Quote, "This is Mr. Combs' kingdom. We're all here to serve in it." Now, Neama, David James says this is what he was told. Is that enough to establish that everybody knew what the goals were? Everybody had a, quote, common purpose? That hierarchical language, does that help prosecutors establish what you mentioned before, the association in fact enterprise required under RICO?
I think it is enough, and there's different types of conspiracies. This is going back to law school, if the law students are watching, really kind of that wheel and spoke. Even if Combs is dealing with James directly, and he's directly dealing with other people, and James and let's say someone like Christina, his chief of staff, weren't communicating with each other, that is enough as long as the conspiracy runs through Combs. And when James testified, he talked about buying the condoms, the Astro Glide, for the freak-offs. That is enough. That's the overt act and furtherance of the conspiracy, right? He also bought for Men a hair dye.
He set up these rooms, very meticulous process, arranged everything from clothing, toiletries, food, drinks, a medicine bag. There were the so-called personal items, baby oil, lubricants, condoms, and then, the unspoken essentials of these gatherings. And he described, and I thought this was important, how he was reimbursed for these expenses. And we're going to get to that a little bit more in a bit. But, you start with the alleged systematic prepping of these rooms. That operational structure where this person was essentially assigned to repeatedly prep for alleged criminal activity, again, does that show an ongoing enterprise, or does the prosecution need more there?
It does. It's more than enough. And in addition to what you mentioned, he was tasked with getting some of the drugs. And in terms of the reimbursement, you talked about certain things were reimbursed by Bad Boy and certain things were paid in cash. And Combs's infamous Louis Vuitton bag usually had around $10,000 in cash for things that were unlawful. I mean, look, there's nothing unlawful with paying in cash, but when you're getting reimbursed for legitimate business expenses and other things are being paid cash, the jury can certainly infer that that's because they knew what they were doing is unlawful.
Yeah, I mean, he testified that reimbursements work differently depending on what he was buying. So food and drinks, those expenses covered through official Bad Boy Entertainment channel, right? Food and drinks, no problem there. The personal items, those payments came in cold hard cash, specifically stacks of bills that James says Diddy kept in that Louis Vuitton bag. And, that form of payment is interesting when you think about it. How critical do you think it is for prosecutors to prove that employees knew they were facilitating crimes versus, hey, I'm just doing my job. He wants this. I'm not going to ask any more questions.
Yeah, I mean, doing your job, we call it the Nazi defense, isn't a legal defense. Now, obviously, the prosecution is not charging all these individuals, but as long as Combs knew that what he was doing was unlawful, that's enough. You can be charged along with unindicted co-conspirators or even unnamed co-conspirators. So really all that matters in this case is what Combs knew. Even if, James thought he was following his boss's orders and what he was doing was lawful, that doesn't insulate Combs from criminal liability.
And by the way, Cassandra Ventura Fine, star witness in this case, Combs' ex-girlfriend, witness, victim number one in this case, claims that Combs physically abused her, manipulated her, threatened her into these coerced sexual performances, the freak-offs. She mentioned how assistants would clean up the rooms. She mentioned how staff would keep tabs on her. She mentioned how she would be punished by the staff. That's all important as well, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they're all part of it. I mean, there's the cleanup crew, there's the setup crew, there's security who would track her down if she was unavailable or didn't answer her phone. I mean, the entourage, that is the criminal enterprise in this case.
And not everybody can be charged with racketeering. So John Smith off the street might not have the ability to have the team or the resources or the wealth to be able to carry out a racketeering enterprise. But somebody in Sean Combs' position maybe can.
Oh, no question. I mean, people that are running these organizations, it's just like any other business, right? Maybe it doesn't have a board of directors, but there's someone in charge of these criminal enterprises. And there's no doubt in this case that Combs was the head of Bad Boy Records.
So I want to examine one of the prosecution's most disturbing claims, and that is that violence served as a crucial tool of control here. Now, the testimony that we've heard, it paints a brutal pattern, and particularly regarding Combs' alleged treatment of Cassie. And remember, Cassie's own account was quite harrowing. She described being punched, stomped on, kicked during the relationship. But what makes these allegations so powerful is how they're supposedly corroborated from multiple angles. Her former best friend, Kerry Morgan, backed up these claims. Danity Kane singer Dawn Richard provided supporting testimony. Perhaps most damningly, as Neama was talking about, that infamous 2016 surveillance footage from the Intercontinental Hotel in LA, where we see Combs appearing to physically assault Cassie. So Neama, first of all, prosecutors, they're not only spending so much time on alleged sex trafficking for the individual sex trafficking charge, because there is sex trafficking by force, fraud, coercion of victim one. So you're using those means to induce somebody into commercial sex acts, right, with sex workers. But I think, Neama, they believe this may be one of the stronger underlying predicate crimes that they can win.
Oh, no question. I mean, the violence is very, very important to the case. Unfortunately, for prosecutors, simple assault can't be a RICO predicate act, but if it's in furtherance of a kidnapping or an extortion or bribery, all that evidence comes in. And like you said, the best evidence in the case from the beginning has been the video evidence. That's why it was discussed at length during jury selection. That's why the defense is trying to draw this fine line between the physical violence, the domestic violence, and sex trafficking and assault.
But you believe that video is also evidence of a criminal enterprise too?
I do, because it was Cassie leaving a freak off, right? And she was forced to return to that hotel room. That's kidnapping. After the freak off, when hotel security came, that's when an attempted bribery occurred, right? There was potential obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. So Cassie wouldn't report the incident to law enforcement.
And sex trafficking allegations.
Of course, sex trafficking itself, no question. But aside from sex trafficking, that's what makes the statute so powerful and broad. Even if people do think that it was somehow consensual, I don't think Cassie was consenting to being kidnapped or being beaten or, the bribery or the obstruction. I think there's many different ways for the prosecution to win here with this RICO statute.
I have a lot more to get into, but real quick, do you think the jury's going to understand all this? And that's not a slight on their intelligence. This is a very, very, very complicated charge. I think that this whole case comes down to closing arguments, how the prosecution explains it, how the jury instructions lay it all out. I mean, am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I think the number one question I've been getting, and I'm sure in the comments to this video is, well, yeah, there's domestic violence, there's maybe even rape, but what does any of this have to do with sex trafficking or racketeering? People think of sex trafficking like it's human trafficking, right? You're going to kidnap someone, lock them in a cage, and force them to have sex. Well, we know that that's not the definition of sex trafficking, right? It's just there's an interstate component, but there's sex with force, fraud, or coercion. I mean, as lawyers, we know that, right? Racketeering, again, you think of the mob, right? Someone shows up, knocks on your door and asks for protection money, right? Or they shake you down, or they rough you up. Again, not typically charged in these types of cases. But again, the federal government has limited jurisdiction, so we can't charge all these state crimes in federal court. But I think the prosecution in closing has to connect these dots and explain it. We know it, we see it, but I'm not sure the jurors do yet.
So moving on now to Dawn Richard. Okay, so she testified that she saw Diddy try to hit Cassie with a skillet in 2009 before dragging her by her hair. And then in this separate incident, she said she saw him punch her at a dinner where other high-profile celebrities like Usher were supposedly. Cassie's ex-best friend testified that during a Jamaica vacation, she says she witnessed Diddy drag Cassie by her hair in the Hollywood Hills. She claims she saw him kick Cassie, and even most shockingly, maybe, Morgan revealed she too was allegedly physically assaulted by Combs, which we're going to get to too. But Neama, I want to start with this because the indictment lists assaulting victims as a pattern in the RICO description. You're right, it's not a predicate act, but it's a pattern of it. And would you say witnessing Combs allegedly punching and kicking Cassie during these various incidents, it helps transform what could be simply a pattern of domestic violence into a racketeering act?
I do, Jesse. Obviously, we have the pattern of violence, right? But when you have Dawn Richard also testifying that Diddy essentially threatened her and said she may disappear if she speaks out, that's the obstruction of justice. That's the intimidation. So you can use the violence to not only show the pattern, but to get to one of those racketeering charges, those predicate acts.
Yeah. And by the way, she testified that these assaults occurred in front of other people. So security guards, industry power players like Usher, Jimmy Iovine. Could that suggest that the alleged violence was tacitly accepted as part of this is bad boys operating culture, this is what they do? What do you think?
I think so. I mean, this is one of the worst kept secrets in Hollywood that, Combs was allegedly physically and sexually abusive. I mean, the question we always get is, how can this happen for so many years and no criminal charges be brought? How can a hotel security guard see this video and the LA County District Attorney not do anything? And I think you're right. I think this is all part of the persona and unfortunately acceptance of Combs acting like this. And frankly, that's why he kept doing it, because he kept getting away with it.
Yeah, yeah. And then I go to Kerry Morgan, right? So her testimony about the violence that she allegedly suffered at Diddy's hands and why this particular incident could be crucial for the racketeering case, because she described this alleged brutal attack where Diddy allegedly struck her with a coat hanger so violently that she claims it left her with a concussion. And the context of that is she says Diddy was interrogating her about Cassie's supposed infidelity. But here's where it gets kind of legally significant, because after the attack, Morgan testified that Diddy allegedly paid her $30,000 in exchange for signing an NDA. Actually, it was apparently done through Cassie. So Neama, the $30,000 NDA payment to Morgan occurred after she witnessed Combs' assault of Cassie. Does this qualify as witness tampering? Does this, as one of the predicate acts, does this further criminal activity?
I think it does. And now you see a pattern of not only violence, Combs paying to make it go away. Obviously, we saw him pay unsuccessfully to try to get the surveillance video from the hotel. Now he's paid Morgan for her silence, right? An NDA. And we know, of course, that an NDA can't prevent a witness from testifying in court. That's another question we've been getting. And now there's legislation to even invalidate NDAs in sexual assault and sexual harassment cases. But again, you see this pattern. Violence, Combs paying someone for their silence. It can be intimidation, it can be obstruction for those predicate acts.
Yeah, and that's something that comes up too, because if you talk about that security guard, Israel Flores from the Intercontinental, he told the court that immediately after that assault, Diddy kind of locked eyes with him, uttered the words, "Don't tell nobody," tried to give him cash. And then the kicker was Combs allegedly extended that thick stack of cash toward him. He says he refused it. But does it have to be that he was going to be a potential witness in a pending investigation, or does attempting to suppress future testimony, is that enough of that for bribery?
Yeah, he generally has to be a potential witness or a government official, right? Bribing someone in a private setting doesn't necessarily qualify. But here, I think the argument,
witness tampering, right?
Witness, of course. I think here the argument would be, here's someone who's a witness to a felony, and you're trying to dissuade them from reporting it to law enforcement. So that's the argument that I would make. This is someone who is a potential witness to domestic violence, and absolutely it was a bribe.
And then I want to move on to these allegations of threats and blackmail. Okay, other big themes in this case and potentially part of the racketeering case. So Cassie's testimony painted a disturbing picture, that she described how after their 2013 Cannes trip, Diddy played these recordings, or allegedly played these recordings from an alleged freak-off, and kind of suggested to her that he would release them to humiliate her, right? This form of intimidation, this form of keeping her quiet. And this, she said, created a climate of fear where she felt she couldn't refuse his demands, that she constantly was terrified of these blackmail videos being made public. And then she says after they landed, he wanted a freak-off, he got a freak-off. Now, the alleged threats weren't limited to Cassie, right? So Dawn Richard recounted that after witnessing this skillet incident that I mentioned before, Diddy allegedly warned her with a perceived threat, we could go missing if she revealed what she saw. Then Cassie's mother revealed she was forced to wire Diddy $20,000, money taken from a home loan equity, after he allegedly threatened to release explicit videos of her daughter. And Regina Ventura testified that she paid out of fear for Cassie's safety. Neama, why is this so important for racketeering?
So important, Jesse, because now you have pretty strong evidence of blackmail and extortion, right? First, Cassie herself. She participated in the freak-offs because she was threatened by Combs. Dawn Richard threatening to go missing. And the best, of course, is Regina Ventura, who testified that she had to get a home equity line because Combs specifically threatened to release 2 freak-off videos, one of them on Christmas Day, because he was upset that Cassie was now in a relationship with Kid Cudi, and he wanted to be repaid for some of the expenses that he had paid for. Regina wired that money. It was returned without explanation 4 or 5 days later, but that's too late. That is textbook extortion and a RICO predicate act.
And let's talk a little bit more about Cassie for a second, because she provided emotional testimony last week. She described what federal prosecutors alleged was not just an abusive relationship with Sean Diddy Combs, that this wasn't just domestic violence, but this participation in a criminal enterprise meeting the legal definition of sex trafficking. And she detailed how Combs' staff, allegedly facilitated elaborate sexual encounters, the freak-offs, procuring the supplies, replenishing materials, handling post-event cleanups, booking hotels in multiple cities, Miami, Los Angeles, Ibiza. Remember, the transportation element's important for sex trafficking. And she testified that she was instructed to source and vet escorts online, arrange their travel, pay them thousands of dollars in cash from Combs or his security team. And she really hammered in on elements that would make this, not consensual, highlighting that she feared blackmail from recordings that Combs allegedly made. She felt unable to refuse his demands because he was in control of her career. Talked about the violence as well, or the alleged violence, that she claims he even raped her in 2018 when she says she told him she was ending their relationship. And, there was something else that I want to mention too, because she testified that staff would keep tabs on her, that Diddy would even punish her for things such as smiling at him the wrong way. So you could see how that's all important. But there was something else, something specific that I want to get into. Arson. So arson is actually also another underlying predicate crime for racketeering. And this came up in reference to a big name who's actually set to testify in this trial, rapper Kid Cudi. Because during Cassie's testimony, she told the jury that Diddy once threatened to blow up Kid Cudi's car when he found out she was dating him in 2011. And around that time, he made this alleged threat. The car blew up. Cassie even went on to say that the next time she saw Cudi, she was with Diddy and he asked him, "What about my vehicle?" So Neama, arson predicate, straightforward?
Very strong arson case, and obviously not being charged with arson, but as a RICO predicate act, he's telling people, including Cassie and Kid Cudi, that he's going to blow up his car, and the car blows up. And even if he didn't blow up the car, if he just agreed to do it and, there was that overt act, that's enough for a RICO conspiracy. So I think we have a strong case for arson as one of the RICO predicate acts as well.
One more thing I want to get to, and this came out actually as we're doing this recording today. You had this special agent with Homeland Security who was instrumental in the raids on Combs' properties. And to give you an idea about some of the things that were found, intimate items, there were high heels, apparently phones in shoes, there were sex toys, there were drugs, there were guns. Possession of drugs with the intent to distribute, again, I believe is one of the underlying crimes for racketeering. So I could see why that might help the racketeering case too. But just generally, these items found, how does this help the idea of a criminal enterprise for racketeering?
Well, it's the force, right? You heard James, for instance, talk about, Combs going to try to find Suge Knight with 3 loaded guns in his lap. You have the components of the AR-15s. Some of them were loaded magazines. This all contributes to a culture of fear and helps prove that force element of both sex trafficking and the violence, that pattern for racketeering.
So I'll ask you the $1 million question. As complicated as it is, as it might seem on its face, how is this all connecting to a criminal enterprise? Do you think the prosecution at this point in the trial, if you went to closing arguments tomorrow, do you think they've proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Sean Diddy Combs is guilty of racketeering conspiracy?
Jesse, I do. I'll go on record on week 2, and I believe the Department of Justice has proven racketeering in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. I think there's plenty of evidence of different predicate acts. You just need 2 over a 10-year period. I think Combs will be convicted of racketeering in this case.
Whew. Well, we shall see. Neama Rahmani, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm sure we'll talk soon.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.